I mentioned to Alice on the way down here that I was, this past week, sort of calculating in my mind how many times I've had the privilege of preaching in this church. And the best that I can calculate it comes out to just about 50 times. Across the years, I was here for several revivals, this prolonged session with you, and it has been a wonderful, wonderful privilege for me to share with you. This is probably an unusual way to end it up, that is, to end up this period of messages with you. But when I came this time, I really didn't think I was going to, and decided I'm not going to talk to them about church stuff. I really feel like when we feed on the Word of God and we have our attention drawn back to Jesus Christ, it has a way of filling our hearts and our lives in a way that nothing else can. And I believe that God has helped us. I think it has been a refreshing time. You're not where you were when I came initially, and hopefully I am not either. It has been a good time to just marinate in the Word of God. And I have reminded you over and over again in each message that the purpose that John had in writing his gospel is that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you would have life in his name. The older I get, the longer I have the privilege of sharing God's Word, the more I find myself recognizing the need to center upon Jesus Christ. In the world in which we live, it is so easy to shoot off in all kinds of secondary directions and to become fascinated with things that are of limited value to us. But when you center in on Jesus Christ, everything changes in terms of our perspective and our understanding. Jesus is the core of the Christian faith. He is the core of the Christian church. It is Jesus who, when the Holy Spirit ministers among us, is lifted up. It is Jesus, when the Holy Spirit fills us, he is filling us with the presence of Christ. It is Jesus that God is trying to make all of us like, Christ-like. That's what holiness is, being like Jesus. And so, this morning, in an unusual way, but one that I believe is intended for us as we wrap our time up together this morning, I want you to take your Bibles and turn to John chapter 11. And I'm encouraging you to keep them on your lap, because I'm not going to read the whole chapter, though we will be referring to the whole chapter before we are finished. Would you stand with me for the honoring of the reading of the Word of God? John chapter 11, beginning the reading with verse number 21. If you don't have a Bible, the person next to you perhaps will share a Bible with you, or there hopefully is a Bible in your pew. I really want you to have a Bible in your hand today, because we're going to approach things a little bit differently today. Martha, before I begin, this is the story of the raising of Lazarus from the dead. But there is so much in it that I would have us to notice this morning. Martha therefore said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother shall rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. Thank you. You may be seated. We've shared this series of messages together over these 9 or 10 weeks, or however many weeks it has been. And we have witnessed and profited by various individuals' encounters with Jesus. We have looked at them together, and as I've been sharing this series of messages with you, most of them have been about people who had unexpected encounters with Jesus. They didn't anticipate what was going to happen to them. They didn't anticipate the encounter. It just came their way. There was a wedding party where Jesus turned water into wine. There was a Samaritan woman who went out. She'd been married to 5 men, and she was living with a man who was no longer her husband, or was not her husband, I should say. And there she had an encounter with Jesus, and Jesus talked to her about having an artesian well of living water coming into her life. There was a Nicodemus who was a religious leader who snuck to Jesus late at night and had some questions for Jesus and discovered a whole new concept of being born again. There was a man who for 38 years was not able to walk, and he went to the Bethesda pool often, anticipating that perhaps he could get into the water when an angel would stir the waters and he could experience a healing touch from God. And Jesus showed up and healed him. And he didn't even know who it was. He didn't know anything about Jesus. The Roman official who came to Jesus and asked him to come and heal his son. And rather than going, Jesus does it without ever showing up. The woman last week who was caught in adultery, dragged into the temple before Jesus, and intimated that she needed to be stoned to death. And Jesus, rather than throwing the stone at her, extended to her the grace of God and the transformation of her life. All these were unexpected encounters with Jesus. There was forgiveness, there were miracles, there was transformation, there were unknown truths that were discovered by various people. There was nothing normal about their encounters with Jesus. But what do you do? What do you do when your encounter with Jesus does not live up to your expectations? When your walk with God doesn't get a boost to your faith, but a testing of your faith. What do you do then? Philip Yancey once wrote, "True atheists do not, I presume, feel disappointed in God. But those who commit their lives to God, no matter what, instinctively expects something in return. An atheist doesn't even believe in God, so why would he think that God would do anything for him or her? But if you commit yourself to God, and you know all the promises of the Scriptures, isn't it somewhat natural that you would expect God to do something for you? Through the many years of ministry that God has given to Alice and me, I have met many people whose disappointments with God led to their dismissing of their faith. Some even turned on God. Prayers that were never answered, healings that never took place, problems that were never solved, children who were never rescued, marriages that were never salvaged, finances that never seemed to be adequate. Behind each of those things that I just referred to, I could stand up here, but I wouldn't, and tell you about some agonizing conversations that I have had with people just like you, who have experienced things in their lives, asking God for solutions that never came. Sometimes they wondered if God was unfair. After all, I've been in churches where a person over this side is giving a testimony, where a person over that side at the very same time is asked God for the same thing. And this person got it and that person didn't get it. Is God unfair? Or feeling that God is silent. I begged you and begged you and begged you with tears and with fasting and with seeking God, and you never came through for me, God. You've just been silent or hidden. God, I know you're like the sun. You're up there somewhere, but there sure is a cloud cover between me and you, God, and I can't see you. There are moments when we read the Bible and we dismiss the early parts of the story because we know the ending. It's sort of like watching a movie and seeing the rerun. You already know how it ends, so some of the drama, it comes out of the movie. It's not like the first time you saw it. And because of that, we can dismiss some things that we find in the Scriptures because we know what the outcome is already. I remember that as a boy, a young boy, agonizing over the 1960 World Series between the Pittsburgh Pirates and the New York Yankees. Every game that the Yankees won, they won by astronomical runs. They set the record that year for the number of runs that were scored or achieved in a World Series. Every game that the Pittsburgh Pirates won, which were my team, we barely won. And so this thing stretched out. It stretched out until the 7th game of the World Series. It stretched out to the last half of the 9th inning, and the score was tied. And Bill Mazeroski, my childhood hero, Bill Mazeroski, came up in the bottom of the 9th inning. He was the first batter to bat for the Pirates. He hit a ball. Yogi Berra was playing left field for the Yankees. That's important for you to know. And Bill Mazeroski hit a pitch. Bill Mazeroski hardly ever hit a home run. Bill Mazeroski hit a pitch. The ball kept going and going and going. It went over the head of Yogi Berra in left field. Along the left field line, there was this big scoreboard. If he would have hit it over here, it would have hit the scoreboard and bounced back, and he'd have probably got a double. Over the other side was the center field. It was 420 feet in center field, way, way, way back. But he hit it right in between those over Yogi Berra's head. And he hit a home run. And we won. You needed to know. Forbes Field is now torn down. There is no more Forbes Field there. No more Forbes Field. But if you go to Pittsburgh, we Pittsburghers are very loyal. If you go to Pittsburgh, you will find that the wall over which Mazeroski hit that home run is still there. It will be there till Jesus comes, I think. And we won the game. I was so excited. My grandmother, she made sure that I could watch every game of that World Series. I would run home from school to watch the game. Back then, they were in the afternoon. This time, I ran the whole way home from school to watch the 7th game of the World Series, the most important game of the whole series, to watch that. And I ran in the front door, and here my grandmother had scrubbed the carpet in the room where the TV was. And I had to listen to it on the radio. When that home run went over that left field fence, I want you to know that I was so excited, I ran out the back door into the alley behind us. I ran up and down the alley, dancing and yelling and screaming. I think I probably spoke in tongues. I was so very excited. Now I want you to know that every once in a while, they'll give a rerun of that 7th game of the World Series, classic game. And I'll watch it. But I have none of the emotional tension. Because every time I've watched a rerun of it, Mazeroski hits the same home run. When you know the end of the story in the Bible, sometimes it takes out for you a lot of the significance of what we find in the Scriptures. And so my professor in seminary said, if you are able, the best thing that you can do is read the Bible as though you were reading it for the first time. Hard thing to do. Hard thing to do. The story of Lazarus' death is such a journey that we are so familiar with. We know the ending. So it is easy for us to miss the underlying disappointment that flows through this scripture. So I want us to visit the story, the incident of Jesus and Lazarus. I would like you to try to help you, insert you into the story. And as we read it, as we talk about it, I'd like you to think this way. Imagine this is your brother or your sister, your child, your grandchild. your spouse, rather than the Lazarus of so long ago. And I'm going to ask you to have your Bibles open and on your lap. And I'm just going to walk you through this with me, a different way of preaching this morning. Jesus is along the Jordan River. If you go to the text before this, he's along the Jordan River, probably in the area where John the Baptist would have performed many of the baptisms. He's about 5 miles away from Bethany. That is the city of Bethany, that is only 2 miles away from Jerusalem. And so, while he is there, Mary and Martha, 2 sisters, send word that their brother Lazarus, with whom Jesus had a significant relationship, is sick. The Greek word that is used there doesn't mean he doesn't have like a cold. He is very ill. And they send word to Jesus. And I'm sure that they anticipate that what's going to happen is that Jesus is going to very quickly come to them because they know that he loves them. He knows that they love him as well, and they have had this ongoing significant relationship with each other. Surely if we send word to Jesus, Jesus will leave the Jordan, he'll leave that setting, and he'll immediately come to us. But Jesus, in verse number 4, just seemingly dismisses their message. When Jesus heard it, he said, "This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it." Jesus just seems to dismiss it. He really isn't as sick, or the situation is not as bad as they think it is. So, he just dismisses it. You know, in our minds, sometimes things are different than they actually are, aren't they? But when you feel it, you sure wish God would feel the same way about it as you do. The sense of urgency, according to verse number 6, seems to escape Jesus. When therefore he heard that he was sick, he stayed then 2 days longer in the place where he was. Only 5 miles away, certainly further, take longer to get there when you walked as they did, but only 5 miles away. Jesus, we need you to come, because Lazarus, our brother, the one that you love so much, is sick. And we discover in verses 11 through 13 that Jesus assesses the situation totally differently than everybody else. This he said, after that he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go that I may awaken him out of the sleep." The disciples therefore said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he was speaking of literal sleep. Jesus is assessing the situation totally differently than Mary and Martha and others. And Jesus responds in a most unusual way in verses 14 and 15. He basically says, "I'm glad he's dead." Listen to what he says. Then Jesus therefore said to them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. but let us go to him. I'm glad he's dead. What? How can you say that? This is Mary and Martha. This is Lazarus. God, how can the Son of God say something like that? I'm glad he's dead. I'm glad for your troubles. I'm glad for the situation you're in. How can you say that? How can you say that when I have loved you and love you like I do? And Jesus does something in verse 4 and in verse 15 that is so significant. He says in verse 4, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it, in verse 15. And I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Jesus makes it not about Lazarus, but about himself. I know you're all concerned about Lazarus. I know that your heart goes out to Lazarus. I know you want me to rescue him. I know that you want me to come and heal him. But I want you to know, this isn't about Lazarus. It's about me. Martha, on the other hand, in verses 20 and 21, she believed it was all about timing, and Jesus was late. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary still sat in the house, and Martha therefore said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's all about timing. Jesus, if you would have come when the word came to you, if you would have come and done this when we asked you to do it, everything would have turned out differently. But Jesus, you let us down. You didn't come. Martha, we discover in verses 23 and 24, she tries to rationalize her disappointment. Beginning with 22, even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God you will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother shall rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. She did the spiritual thing. I can't explain what God has done. I can't explain why he didn't care enough to come. And so I'll give some grandiose spiritual rationalization for it, to make it sound better, to make me feel better. Yeah, Jesus, I know. You know, I've been a minister and done probably a couple hundred funerals. I get so tired of Christian platitudes. People come to the gravesite of a little child and they say to a parent, all things work together for good to those who love God. God must have needed another angel for the children's choir. If something ever happens to my dear, dear wife, don't ever come to me with those platitudes. I hate simple, ridiculous Christian platitudes where we try to rationalize some things that hurt so deeply and are so unexplainable. That's good preaching, Harry. Thank you. Jesus turns her disappointment into a faith crisis, verses 25 through 27. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord. I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. Mary is put on the spot in the midst of her exceedingly difficult disappointment. And Jesus says, Mary, do you still believe in me? Do you still believe what I say is true, even though you're crushed? Even though you feel like I've let you down? Mary, do you still believe? Or Martha, do you still believe? Excuse me. Mary also believes it was all about timing. Verse number 32. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mary believed the same thing. It was a timing issue. Martha's not the only one who thinks this. I think it too. And then we discover verse number 37. But some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of him who was blind have kept this man from dying? In other words, the crowd believed the same thing. There had been a lot of talk going on, apparently. Martha says it. Mary says it. The crowd says it. You know, if Jesus would have just come, if he would have just come when we called him, Lazarus would have never died. There's something stunning in the midst of this. Verse 33. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled, and said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And Jesus wept. And so the Jews were saying, Behold how he loved them. Or him. I wrote a little question. Does God cry when we cry? When our hearts are shattered, when we are overwhelmed by situations, the Bible says that God is moved by the feelings of our infirmities. God somehow feels our pain, our struggles, our difficulties. Now we know that Jesus acts, and verses 45 and 46 give us the outcome. Many therefore of the Jews who had come to Mary and beheld what he had done believed in him. And some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. This is hard to get our heads around and our minds around. But it is important for us who see God as always obligated to us, and not seeing God as a sovereign God, as a God who sees a picture that goes far beyond us. Sometimes we are just a prop in the greater scheme of what God is doing. The shining forth of His glory, the display of who He is, the effort to transform our lives. He has plans that we know nothing about, and sometimes purposes that would blow our mind if we could see them. We live with this tiny pinhole view of what life and what this world is all about. We only have a pinhole view through which we look and try to figure out this whole life. God has this massive understanding of things. Isaiah the prophet wrote, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." That doesn't always comfort me, to realize that God knows things that I don't know. And God understands things that I do not understand. And God sees things to which I am blind. Everybody was saying, "You know, Jesus, if you would have gotten here, none of this would have happened." But because Jesus paid the glory of God, we're seeing. How can we trust God when we don't know the end from the beginning? Our stories are being written. If we knew the end, we'd be able to look back and say, sure, it's sort of like Lazarus. We know how it comes out. We're not doing our lives are not a drama that's in a rerun. We don't know how it ends. The situation that you're in the middle of, we don't know how it ends. How do we trust God when we are disappointed with God? Martha was disappointed with God. If you'd have been here, this wouldn't have happened. Mary was disappointed with God. If you'd have been here, this wouldn't have happened. The crowd was disappointed with God. If he'd have shown up, this would have never happened. I do not say this casually. I say it because it's the honest truth. The alternative to disappointment with God is disappointment without God. Because all of us are going to experience disappointment in our lives. What we choose to believe will not eliminate disappointment in our lives. Disappointment challenges our faith, and it produces tremendous emotional struggle in our lives. In fact, disappointments can alter how we view God and how much confidence we put in God. Bertrand Russell was one of the most significant influencers of today's philosophy and of education in our world. He, along with Nietzsche, has had a tremendous impact on how our world is viewed. The secularism that makes every effort to marginalize any concept of God, pushes God out of our education, pushes God out of our morality, pushes God out of our philosophy. Bertrand Russell was one of the main influencers. He was a German philosopher, and his philosophy has weaved itself right down into our educational system and into our society. In his early years, he was attracted to the Christian faith, and in fact, he studied ardently the Christian faith. At the age of 18, he decided to toss out Jesus. He became an atheist by his own admission. It obviously affected how he taught and what he believed. For you can't, if you take God out of your classroom, out of your teaching, out of your philosophy, it greatly impacts what you have to say and how you say it. Bertrand Russell, later in his life, wrote these words. He said, "The center of me is always and eternally a terrible pain. A curious, wild pain," he says. "Searching for something beyond what the world contains." This man who had rejected God confessed that he spent the rest of his life trying to find a God that he had thrown away. Blaise Pascal, one of the great inventors, he is the one who in the 17th century, believe it or not, in the 17th century, invented the modern calculator. So much of what happens in the whole IT field goes back to concepts. He was an inventor and a mathematician. He was an atheist who eventually came and gave his life to Jesus Christ. And he wrote this. I wish Bertrand Russell would have understood this. He said, "There is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of each person, which cannot be satisfied by anything, but only by God the Creator, made known through Jesus Christ." Prior to the raising of Lazarus, Jesus turned to Martha, and he asked her, in the midst of her disappointment, before the disappointment was resolved, before the answers had come, before Lazarus had come from the tomb, before Lazarus had had the wrappings taken off from him, he turned to her and he said, "Martha, are you willing to put your flag of faith and stake it in this ground? Do you believe this, Martha? That I am the resurrection and the life, and he that believeth in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die." Mm-hmm. Her response was, "Yes, Lord. I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world." Karl Barth had a theological mind that is incomprehensible to me. He was a German theologian who wrote the Dogmatics of Faith, a multi-extended volume of theology, tracing faith and belief from the very rudimentary beginnings to the very climactic endings. An incredible Bible scholar. He was over at Princeton Theological Seminary, a tremendous mind who spent a weekly visit to the prisons to preach to prisoners, those incarcerated in Germany. And he was asked this question while he was giving lectures at Princeton. A student raised their hand and asked him, "What is the most profound truth you have ever discovered?" This incredible mind, this incredible genius. What is the most profound truth that you have ever discovered? He stood on the platform and he said, "Jesus loves me. This I know, for the Bible tells me so."
Mm-hmm.
We learn that as children, and it never gets any better than that. Yes, Mary. Yes, Martha. Yes, Lazarus. Yes, to the crowd. I understand your disappointments. I understand your heartache. I understand you're not being able to understand. But yes, Jesus loves me. This I know. For the Bible tells me so. I believe, despite some enormous disappointments in my life. Do you?
Mm-hmm.
Would you stand with me?